Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Chapter 2, Shiva's Smile, from Journey of Insight Meditation by Lerner, as read by Jonathan Nelson.
Chapter 2, Shiva's Smile. It took a couple of months to get used to the lack of drama that each hour of the 10-day retreat had contained. Hover had not given me much advice as to what to do next, except to keep sitting. Often I had no idea what I was doing, but I kept doing it at least 1 hour a day, and although P, my wife, didn't participate, she respected my effort. I hadn't sat this evening, though, due to the rush of getting dinner before P and I went out. Now I wished I had. I wished I could be somewhere dark and quiet where I could close my eyes. "You all set here?" I looked up, startled, as if awakened from a dream. Music was throbbing all around me. The faces of the performers obscured by tobacco smoke shot through with spotlight. The waitress was remarkably patient. I looked at my half-empty beer mug and started to lean across the table, but my wife's attention was absorbed by the musicians on stage. "No thanks," I apologized. The waitress smiled and shrugged, as if to say, "Don't worry about it." She had a pretty, soft face and long brown hair, and I felt uneasy watching her slip away into the sea of floating tables. I glanced across the table again at P, and the immediate gut reaction that arose ended my momentary dilemma. It created a new one in that, now awakened, I was completely aware of wanting to be out of this place and back at our apartment in bed with P. The music ended, and P turned to me with an excited smile. The musicians were friends of hers. She was looking to see if I appreciated them. My smile was forced, and I don't think she fell for it. It didn't help that I had come mainly because I didn't want to sit home alone. I had also come because it made her happy. She didn't like wandering into crowded bars alone. Despite the fact that she had recently chosen to be a rock musician and looked and dressed the part, people scared the hell out of her. I loved her for both aspects. "Ready to go?" I asked, not doing too well at appearing nonchalant. I asked her if she wanted another drink. She shook her head. My discomfort was too apparent. It surprised me. I used to feel quite at home in the soft fog of alcohol, through which the faint outline of illicit undertakings were still visible. Now, instead of working my way to the bottom of one mug after another until a sweet cloud of unconcern enveloped me, I found myself surrounded by the sober, nagging memory of my body disappearing. All my attention drawn to a bright flame in my chest. My mind still. I wanted to be there. I was startled by the thought. In the 8 months that had passed since I left Hover, this feeling had never expressed itself with such clarity. But there it was. "P," I whispered almost fiercely. "Let's go." Then, because it needed an explanation, "I'm really tired." Outside in the cold, raw Cambridge night, we walked quickly and silently back to our apartment. I felt awful. My uneasiness in the bar had unearthed my complete discomfort with my present situation. I was biding time. We had planned to leave America in the fall when P finished school. 4 years ago, I had made my first trip out into the world and gotten as far as India. It had more of an effect on me than chemical journeys. Since then, I'd traveled more and wider and guarded carefully against the growth of any roots. I wanted out. Out of apartments and telephone bills, expensive dope, and cold city streets. I could be an unpublished writer anywhere, so it might as well be Pāli. P hadn't been much happier with her own life for a long time, and was into the one-way ticket idea as much as I. Recently, though, her music career had begun to take more shape, so we hadn't talked about travel plans for a while. I put my arm around her shoulder as we walked. I felt a sigh escape her. Or maybe it was me. Forgive me, I wanted to say, for being discontented. But the words didn't come. Instead, I looked longingly at her, feeling only the gut desire to be closer and closer, to be right next to her, to be within her completely, totally, to experience a completeness that I couldn't find or even look for anymore in words or amusement or anyone else. Be here for me, a small, exhausted voice screamed within me. It was a voice of pure pain. I'd been screaming at P for years, but only heard the voice during those 10 days of silence on the retreat with Hover. I recognized it now as the voice of desire, of clinging. I didn't want to need her, but I was grabbing, and it seemed to double the pain now to be aware of that. I wandered around the apartment aimlessly, put on a record, then sat in the living room thumbing through a magazine, wishing I knew what to do to stop the helpless drift away from P. She came in and sat down on the couch across from me. I'm not going to be able to leave in the fall, she announced, struggling to make it sound impersonal. I realize that I've been looking to traveling because I had nothing else to do. Now I do. I want to make music, she shrugged. I'm sorry. Really, I know how much you've been planning on it, but I wouldn't be happy going, and that wouldn't help either of us. At that moment, I wished I had had a few more beers. My sobriety was unbearable. The idea of another winter in New England, trying to write books nobody seemed to want to read, deciding whether to stay up late waiting for P to get home from playing bars with a rock band, or to sit on beaches alone, to walk through bazaars, picking up trinkets to send back to her. That wasn't what I'd been looking forward to at all. I thought of a possibility, she finally said. Her voice was full of sympathy. My pain hurt her. Those friends of yours, with whom you did the course with Hover, talked about another meditation teacher who studied with the same Burmese teacher as Hover. He's giving retreats all the time in India. You've said that what you'd really like to do is, do it for real. It's a thought. Halfway around the world seemed a long way to go with all my eggs in one basket. What if I didn't like it? Besides, I'd been more than ready to leave Hover's course after 8 days. I really couldn't picture doing that for 6 months. But at the same time, just talking about it raised the hair slightly on the back of my neck. In a way, it was even more exotic and romantic than hanging out under a coconut tree. I decided to go. 6 months later, I was in India. Curiously, after an absence of 4 years in which I'd spent so much time planning a return, I now found the mystique of India lost on me. The familiarity of hashish smoke in the hallways and the thin, sunburnt Westerners nodding through adventure were familiar yet disconcerting. The temptation of mental anarchy that had led me astray the first time I traveled east in search of a spiritual guide to point the way no longer had any force, except to dispel my lingering mythology about that first journey. Outside, it was the same as I stood on a street corner, recalling the exhilaration of my first visit. Go to India, everyone said. No one really knew why then, except that that was where it was all supposed to be. And so when one arrived, everything glowed with a reverential light, like spiritual artifacts. Which wasn't bad, I suppose. India had forced my mind open. By presenting me with possibilities of life that I'd never even considered, it had battered the idea of how things should be. Endless options. My practice back then was to try them. My mistake was to assume that the experience itself was the wisdom. Letting go of so many set patterns, set thoughts, and associations, nuzzling up to the chaos makes you high, free. But that kind of high is dizzying, and if you ever try to put your feet on the ground again, you fall on your face. Now, 4 years later, my feet were on the ground. The last time I reveled in everything. Now I picked my way more carefully and didn't feel that I was missing anything special. I stood on the street corner with my feet carefully placed to avoid the flat cakes of cow dung, watching the surrealistic juxtapositions of the real India, a bullock cart and a double-decker bus halted side by side at a red traffic light. The mania for personal cleanliness that ignores the casualness of public defecation. The ritual bathing in filthy water. India still made no sense to me, but I no longer found any particular sense in that nonsense. People shitting in the streets had no quality more or less mystical than using a toilet bowl. Nothing shocked me, but I was weary of India's recognizability. The only address I had been given in India was the business office of S.N. Goenka. Sri Goenka had grown up in a caste Hindu among the Indian community residing in Burma. There, in the midst of a highly successful business career, he had made the acquaintance of Uba Khin, an important Burmese official who was a Buddhist and a teacher of meditation. Over a period of years, Goenka became one of the Burmese teacher's leading disciples, and near the end of his life, Uba Khin commissioned him to continue the teaching of Vipassana meditation in India, the land where the Buddha first taught. Now, although still involved with his family's extensive business operations, Goenka spent most of his time traveling around India teaching meditation. I was given these and many more details by Sri Goenka's secretary in Bombay, who, over numerous cups of tea, outlined the teacher's schedule for the months ahead and helped me to plan my program. It was disappointing to learn that Goenka would not be back to this part of India to conduct a retreat for 3 weeks, but it was interesting to learn that Robert Hover was in India right then with Goenka at a course in Madras. Hover would be traveling from there to Uba Khin's meditation center in Burma to spend some time with Uba Khin's Burmese disciples before returning to India to conduct a series of retreats on his own. All of this was a surprise to me, since I'd just about lost track of Hover in the past months. We had exchanged some letters in the year since our last meeting, but then apparently the pressures of family life and of being a meditation teacher had created too great a conflict, and he had decided to drop the latter. I wondered what had changed that. I looked at the schedule Goenka's secretary had neatly drawn up. With a few days allowed for train connections, I signed up for a 2-month stretch of retreats with Goenka and Hover at different locales. I didn't dwell on the memory of how long just 10 days of meditation with Hover had seemed. The more immediate problem, it occurred to me, was what to do alone in Bombay for the next 3 weeks. A few miles out in Bombay Harbor is an island known as Elephanta, maintained by the government as a tourist attraction because of its ancient Hindu temples cut out of rock. After too many days in my hotel room, I rationalized a tourist venture as the safest way to use up my time. But as I went down the wharf to the ferry, I nearly turned back. All the confrontations I had so neatly avoided now overwhelmed me. I was stopped in my tracks and filled with outrage at the sight of starving mothers begging with babies in their arms in the shadows of the luxurious Taj Mahal hotel, while nearby liveried servants walked their masters' huge pet dogs, which probably consumed more food each day than a dozen of these street dwellers. As I stood there, gaping, the women swarmed the tourists with piteously practiced whines and rote presentations of their plights. Their mothers had probably held them weeping on this very spot. My outrage now encompassed the beggars, and I didn't know whom to root for. I had as much sympathy for the fat tourists under assault as I did for their assailants. Everyone looked ugly. I sat in a corner of the little open launch that would take me to Elephanta and watched the passengers climb on. The last passenger to board was practically naked, except for a long, dirty cotton cloth wrapped around his loins like swaddling. His skin, a rich, coppery brown color, had a well-worn hide-like tone to it, apparently his principal protection from the elements. It fitted his frame closely, without a hint of unhealthy thinness. His muscles were supple and energetic. Like a cat, he settled into a neat ball in a corner and surveyed his surroundings. His long, thick, tangled hair was piled on top of his head, his face a thing of beauty, with the skin stretched over high cheekbones like powerful drums. The forehead was wide and unmarked above eyes that talked for him. I watched them play a dozen roles. The obsequious fool, making his way on board over the objections of the worried crew. The holy dignitary disdaining half-hearted attempts to make him pay for his fare. The righteous one surveying this worldly scene. The mad mystic rolling his eyes back, laughing in his head. And finally, a very gentle, lovely being letting his eyes meet mine for a moment in a friendly, generous gesture of greeting that left me bewildered and flattered. He was a sadhu, a wandering, matted-hair religious ascetic. No one knows the origin of these holy men, but in 3000 BC, Aryan invaders of the subcontinent found them dwelling on the fringe of society in forests and caves. What deity a sadhu may worship or what specific yogic practices he may undertake are really secondary to his way of life. His abandonment of all social institutions, home, family, means of livelihood, is his real vehicle for transcendence. He ignores society and he carries no baggage through the doorway to another reality. Yet Indian society even today recognizes in the seemingly antisocial activities of these religious men some value for the society as a whole, and supports their existence by alms. The boat pulled into the dock at Elephanta. The sadhu leaped off gingerly and was gone down the quay, singing and laughing before I could formulate any strategy to remain in his company. I spent the next hour leaning against a wall in a cool cave, staring at an enormous, three-dimensional image of Shiva's head carved out of a rock. With a cool, detached upward curve to the edge of the mouth, the smiling face seemed bemused by my predicament. Outside the cave it was warm and breezy. There were shady trees everywhere. I set off around the edge of the hill. A short way down the trail, I heard a voice bellowing out a song. About 50 feet away from me, I saw the sadhu, near the mouth of another cave, in a nook formed by two perpendicular rock walls. Naked except for a little swatch of cloth that covered his crotch, he was pouring water over his head from a bucket brought by a serving woman. Our eyes met, and he smiled. Without thinking, I walked over to him. I felt a little awkward being a spectator to his bath, but he didn't seem to mind. When he had meticulously dried himself and rewrapped his body in his cloth, he sat down and smoked a few pipefuls of ganga, Indian marijuana, all the while staring at the sky, smiling and humming. I waited for the next moment. I knew what it would be. He's going to ask me for something. I was a little saddened that it was going to turn out that way, that there was no honesty to be found, and that I would be cast in the role of a sucker. Then I made a remarkable turnabout. I decided to give him whatever he wanted, gladly, and consider it alms. After all, this was how he lived. I immediately relaxed, and we began to talk. Or rather, he kept bellowing his chants. I interrupted him with questions. He laughed at some and answered others. When I asked him his age, he told me to guess. When I asked where he came from, he shrugged. Then he pointed at me and said, "Sadhu?" I didn't know what to answer. Then, in an amazing monologue, sprinkled with a few English words, employed with startling originality, he told me about his life. He had grown up in a rich family and been sent to fine schools to be an engineer. "Study, study, study," he muttered, his brows furrowed, his lips puckered, and his eyes totally crazed in an outrageous pantomime. He ripped his imaginary books to shreds and threw them into the air. "School," he said, bringing his face closer to mine. Then he giggled. "Home," and shook his head. "Family," practically roaring with laughter. He looked at his cloth and little bundle and shrugged. Then, suddenly, he offered me the Ganga pipe. I froze. My careful posture was threatened. He wanted me to come closer, to enter his psychic space. What would I do if he came back to Bombay with me, to my room? I thought quickly about my cache of possessions, my little alarm clock, my insect repellent, my multiple vitamins and foam rubber sleeping mat. He might take one of them. I refused the drug. We sat there silently for a while until he started singing again. Then I heard a loud tisk, tisk. Standing practically beside us was a well-dressed, overweight, Western-styled Indian man wearing a watch so large he could have used a sling around his neck to support it. "Pay no attention to this fellow's antics," he exhorted me, shaking his head disapprovingly. Then he said something in Hindi to the sadhu, which from the tone of it sounded like, "Don't bother the tourists, you'll give the country a bad name." That broke the sadhu up completely. He hooted with laughter, pointing at the gentleman and shaking his head in amusement. Mortified, the gentleman silently appealed to me to censure this ruffian's behavior. I couldn't understand what he expected me to do. Then it flashed on me that there I was, dressed much in the way the Indian was imitating. I was a respectable white tourist. What could I find remotely sympathetic about a naked madman? At first, I was outraged by this well-heeled Indian's assumption that we had anything in common. Then I was saddened by how much we did. All along, I had prided myself on how lightly I was traveling on this journey. But lightness, I was learning, is an attitude. Panic over the sadhu making off with my alarm clock was about as heavy as you can get. For all my efforts to deny it, I was a tourist. My passport, my $1,000, and my return ticket were all tucked neatly away in my pants. But more than that, my itinerary was my protection. I was on a package tour, skipping all those spots I assumed I had seen before. I knew what I wanted to see, so I refused all diversions. I was taking no chances, really. I told the Indian man, as politely as I could, that I was quite all right, and that this fellow wasn't really bothering me. He shook his head and walked off. The sadhu offered me a banana from a bunch he had in his stash. I ate it, and he gave me another, and then another, until we finished them all. Of course, I thought, we're both sadhus. Only I'm an American sadhu, and being an American, you don't do anything without being prepared. Especially since I had no idea what I was doing. He had every idea. He had the absolute security of knowing his part in the whole drama, even if it is to play no part. His every move, every gesture, every breath was his practice. For me, it was all groping, seeking to establish an identity. His whole life was about giving up things, letting them go. Renunciation, not denial. I looked again at this man with no name. He pointed to his unhappy, confused countryman walking off in the distance, and emitted a sigh that was full of compassion and relief. I was in India to meditate, to practice or to study meditation. I rolled the phrases around, seeing which might come off my tongue most easily if someone should ask. Actually, I was waiting for someone to ask. I sat alone at one of 4 booths in a tiny closet of a snack bar that was the hottest spot in town, catering to the foreign clientele with a menu of fruit juices and milkshakes artfully tailored to the appetites of a particular state of mind. They still tasted good to me, though my mind was unaltered. I wondered why it was. I wondered why I hadn't talked to anyone in 3 days. And I truly wondered what I was doing here. In the close, hungry, junky faces, unadorned, despite their bells and beads, or in the well-fed, mindless smiles of hashish vacationers, I knew I would find no answer. I got up, paid the Indian man named Deepti, and answered his smile with my own, not sure if his was a sign of a compact of sanity, or bemusement at my predicament. Then I was on the street in the dark, aware of the danger of looking for meaning in a smile. I walked into the Bombay hotel room and tried not to notice it. It had the dimensions of a cell for solitary confinement, with bars on the windows and a trellis of sweating pipes. 2 weeks after my arrival in India, I was still in Bombay, waiting for the man I had come to India to see. Frightened by how much I wanted to be in the company of people, I forced myself to stay alone, apart, silent. I knew before I left America that this part of it would be at least as difficult as sitting cross-legged for 10 hours a day. Being by myself. Waking up in the morning without a familiar body there beside me. The constant thread that links one day to the next. Feeling the eeriness of experience passing through me without the comforting echo of companionship, without a second opinion, each decision my own, the freedom weighed heavily. And yet, without understanding just why, this seemed so essential to my being here. The suffering and the end of suffering. That's what it is all about, Hover had said. For me, the suffering had always manifested itself as a tangle, a blurry confusion in my mind in the presence and closeness of others, and a haunting emptiness in their absence. Biding time now in a strange, hot city, I found that this emptiness would sometimes come creeping out of the walls and frighten me out of the hotel room. For some reason, it was hardest at dusk. I'd be all right during the day, slowly running my carefully organized errands, working my way through 3 meals, reading as much as I could, and meditating for the rest. And then the air would start to cool, and the gentle breeze off the harbor would whisper to me, until I found myself beside the water under a purple, hazy sky, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. I watched the groups of laughing good-timers, and I wondered why I was so insistent on being miserable. Then their tinkling bells and good smells would overcome me, and I'd soon be part of their conversation and company. But it would only take an instant, a few foolish words, a puff of closeness, to recognize the hollowness, to be reminded that what I wanted, had always wanted, was not within this realm at all, and that to even begin to approach it, I would have to turn from the diversions and accept solitude until I could learn simply to be alone.
Pariyatti, a nonprofit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pāli language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.